Hi, I'm Christoph, and today I'm going to show you how to make these caustics and sparkle effects for stylized water in Blender. We are going to make two versions of the caustics effects. One is going to be for still water, and the other one is going to be for a rapid moving current. So without further ado, let's get started. Let's start a new blend file, delete the cube, delete the light, delete the camera, and we are going to add a plane. Let's dive directly into the shader editor. Add a new shader, delete the principal shader, and let's add an emission shader. We're going to need two voronoi textures. And we are going to set them to 2D. The upper one is going to be an F1, and the lower one is going to be a smooth F1. Then we need to add a matte node. Let's set the matte node to subtract. And we are also going to add a color ramp. Let's plug the distance into the upper value and the distance of the smooth one into the lower value. Plug the subtract into the color ramp and the color ramp into the emission. And let's see the effect. Okay. Let's scale this to 20 on both of the voronoi textures. And let's adjust our color ramp. And this gives us a basic caustics effect. This is a very round effect, and we can affect this by adjusting the smoothness. So for instance, if we put the smoothness to 0.5 and then adjust the color ramp, we get a more squared effect. If we lower it even more, we can get it almost where all of the angles are sharp. We want something in between, so let's set it to 0.6 and adjust the color ramp accordingly. Let's also add a mapping node to our voronoi texture. And let's select our plane and copy paste it. On our second plane, we are going to select it and we're going to change the voronoi texture to 3D. This gives a slightly different effect. Some of the holes are filled, but once we get the animation going, these will move, and so it will look a lot better. Let's go back to our 2D voronoi. Click on it. And we are going to animate this by distorting the vector. So in between our texture coordinate and our mapping node, let's add a combine XYZ and a separate XYZ. We already have the X plugged into the X. We are also going to add the Z into the Z. Then we are going to add a matte node. Plug the Y into the value. And then plug the output value back into the Y. And now we are going to add a musgrave noise texture. Let's plug the musgrave into the value. And this distorts our vectors and gives this crazy effect. But the musgrave allows us to control the distortion by using the detail. So let's set detail to 0.02. This gives a subtle effect. Let's add a mapping and texture coordinate node. And now we can manipulate the distortion by moving the Z location. We're going to add a driver to the Z. To do this, we are going to add hashtag frame divided by 500. Let's press play by pressing spacebar. And as you can see, this gives us waves on the water. And this is done by distorting the vector. Let's add an extra layer of distortion. We are going to select the Add Musgrave Mapping and Texture Coordinate. And we are going to copy paste this. Let's add the Add node. We are going to set the scale of the musgrave to 50 and detail to 0.005. And this is going to give us more smaller distortions. And let's animate this by adding hashtag frame divided by 2000. Let's press play. And this gives us 2 layers of distortion. I'm going to set the scale of the first musgrave to 10. And this gives us a bit smaller waves. And this is how you animate the texture. I'm quite happy with the result of this. And you can get different results by manipulating the different settings of the musgrave textures. Let's turn this into a transparent shader. But before we do that, we are going to copy paste our plane. And we are going to move one copy below the other. Let's select the upper section. And this one we are going to make transparent. Let's add a mix shader and a transparent shader. Let's plug the color ramp into the alpha of the mix shader and remove the color ramp from the emission. And to turn this into a transparent shader, we need to go to the material properties, blend mode, and set it to alpha clip or alpha blend. Let's choose alpha blend. Set shadow to none for now. We don't need a shadow. And let's invert our alpha. I'm going to play with the color ramp. Now let's select the lower plane. And this we are going to turn into a shadow. Let's take the black value and turn it into a light blue. Let's take our white value and turn it into a darker blue. Let's play around with the color ramp until we get a result that we're happy with. And now when we press play, we have both the upper caustics and the shadow. One of the last things I want to add is I'm going to set the emission to a strength of 2 on our top layer, because this will make our caustics pop a bit more. That concludes our flat and more 2D version of the water and caustics. Now let's move on to our 3D voronoi. One of the advantages of having a 3D voronoi is that when we manipulate the Z location of the voronoi itself, we get this whirling effect of the water. We can set our Z value to hashtag frame divided by 1000. And as you can see, this animates our voronoi in 3 dimensions and gives this very whirly and chaotic effect. If we also move the X location by also adding frame divided by 1000, we can make this whole section move. And this gives us more of a river effect. I'm now also going to add the same distortion that we made for our first water. So let's go to the top layer of our first water and let's select all the nodes before the mapping node. Let's copy them and let's paste them in. We need to redo our drivers for the mapping when we copy paste it. So for the first node, we add frame divided by 500. And for the second node, we are going to add hashtag frame divided by 2000. And this adds some extra distortion to the water. I think I even want more distortion. So let's play around with the scale and set it to 150 and set detail to 0.002. And this gives us these little tiny details. Let's also set the emission to strength 2. And now we are going to copy paste this plane. Let's put one copy below the other. Select the top one. And we are also going to turn this into a transparent shader by adding a mix shader and adding a transparent shader. Let's also plug the color ramp into the alpha and invert it. And let's also go to material properties and set our blend mode to alpha blend and shadow mode to none. Now we are going to select our bottom layer. We're going to add a color mix RGB node. And I have prepared a texture that I'm going to add with some rocks. So let's add a image texture. And I'm going to open our water rocks and add it to the mix RGB. I'm going to hide our top layer for now. And for this bottom section, I'm going to change the colors of the color ramp. The white value we are going to turn into a nice light green. And our darker value we are going to turn into a darker green, but still a bright color. Let's plug the color ramp into the lower value and set the mix to soft light. And let's adjust our color ramp so that we see our caustics a bit better. We can always turn our darker green into a darker color to get more contrast. This looks nice. I'm going to add a mapping and texture coordinate node to my water rocks, and I'm going to set the scale to 2. Now I'm going to unhide my top layer. Let's select it. And we are going to add some color to our top layer as well. Let's plug the color ramp into the emission. Let's go to our color ramp. Let's move our black all the way to the left. And let's add a blue color. Let's make it a very bright blue. And we are going to move it against the white. Let's make this white and blue ramp really into a sharp edge. And one thing we can do to make our colors really pop is go into our render properties, go to color management, and set filmic to standard. Okay, let's press play. And this is the effect we're going for. Okay, so I'm happy with this result. Let's add some extra sparks to the water. Let's select the top layer. And the first thing we are going to do is add another mix shader. Plug it in. Let's add another emission shader. And I'm going to add this stars texture. And let's plug it into the alpha of the mix shader. Now we want to make the stars look at the camera. So let's add a mapping node and a texture coordinate node. And let's plug the window of the texture coordinate into the vector. And this will make the sparks look at our camera at all times. We are going to set the scale to 1.5 for the X value and 0.75 for the Y value. And now we are ready to animate these stars. In animation, often these effects get rendered at 12 FPS or 8 FPS. And we are going to add a trick to our animation or our driver to simulate this. To do this, let's add a combine XYZ, a separate XYZ, plug our window into the separate. Let's plug the Y value into the Y, the Z into the Z, and plug the vector into our vector. We are going to add 3 matte nodes. Let's plug our X into the last add node and plug the value into the X of the combine. we're going to set our second add to multiply. And our first add we are going to change into ceiling. Then we are going to add an input value. Let's plug these nodes into each other. We are going to set the multiply to 0.3. And we are going to set our value to hashtag frame divided by 3. And this will move our stars at a frame rate of 8 FPS. We can get different frame rates. For instance, if we put frame divided by 2, we get 12 FPS. And it will move every 2 frames. Or we can get an even lower FPS of 6 FPS by dividing it by 4, etc. But for now, we're going to set it to 3. Now we will also add a gradient so that our stars only appear in the middle of our water. So let's add a gradient texture and a mix RGB node. Let's plug our gradient texture into the mix node and set it to multiply. Let's add a mapping node to our gradient texture. To see our gradient texture, we can plug it into our material output, set linear to spherical, and let's also plug the window into our vector. Let's now rescale our spherical gradient by setting scale to 3. And let's move it by manipulating the location until it's in the middle of the screen. Let's plug our mix shader back into the material output. And now we have created a mask for our stars. The last thing I want to do is I want to make our stars twinkle. And to do this, I'm going to add a noise texture. Let's set the scale to 10. Let's add a mix RGB and plug the FAC into our mix RGB. Let's add a color ramp. And let's set our mix to either a multiply or an overlay. Let's add a mapping and texture coordinate node. And we can animate this noise by going to the Z location and add hashtag frame divided by 100. And now when we press play, we get this twinkling star effect on our water. And this is the rendered end result. So that concludes our tutorial. I hope you liked it. I'm going to leave the source files in the description below. Let me know if you liked it in the comment section. Like and subscribe, and see you next time.